and we are very fortunate this evening to have on our call Dr. Norman Blumenthal. Dr. Norman Blumenthal is a licensed clinical psychologist who serves as the Zactor Family Director of Trauma and Crisis Intervention for Ohel, Educational Director of the Bella and Harry Wexner Kollel Elyon and Smicha Honors Program at the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary, Yeshiva University, and Adjunct Professor of Furkov Graduate School in Psychology and Wirtz Wallace School of Social Work of YU. In private practice in Cedarhurst, Dr. Blumenthal is also the founder and chairman of the board of Education of Kahal and a consultant to the Tova Mentoring Program, both in Long Island, and a past vice president at Nefesh, and also a proud member of Young Israel Lawrence Cedarhurst. Dr. Blumenthal is going to be addressing how we process this psychologically and how we talk about it to our kids. After a day when we hear all this news, especially on the social media, and we see that every hour things are changing, one of the most difficult things to deal with is how do we process this without going into panic mode? How do we process this information? How do we talk about it to our kids and to our families in a healthy way? It is a great opportunity to have with us Dr. Blumenthal.
Thank you very much, Roy Trump. And again, shout out to you for orchestrating this, taking the mantle of leadership for the community. I'm going to be, it was mentioned by Trump, I'm going to talk about it psychologically for just a few minutes. And I'm going to take, basically, broadly speaking, two perspectives. One perspective is going to be how do we process this ourselves? How do we get the right perspective on what's happening? And then also how do we impart that perspective to the children? That'll be one topic. And the other will be how do you teach proper hygiene to children and different types of children, different ages? How do you give them over the instructions of, I wouldn't say actually necessarily new behaviors, but behaviors that in the past we might have taken a little bit more lightly than we are going to do now, given the change in circumstances. And again, it's very important in terms of having a perspective, first for two reasons. First of all, anxiety tends to be very contagious. And that if you're around someone who's worried or if there's a panic mode, it's very easy for us to catch on. In some respects, that's adaptive. When there really is a danger, the capacity to impart that danger to a large number of people is important for safety. If there was an attack, if there was something that was more imminently threatening to large numbers of people, to be able to give over that fear so that there is a collective protective action is important. However, very often, sometimes that mechanism that ensures our safety in one circumstance can be contraindicated in others. And in the circumstance we're in is what's so very appropriately and eloquently described by Rabbi Glad. And again, I want to thank Rabbi Glad also for his participation, but also very appropriately conveyed was that there is some concern, and we have to have a somewhat higher vigilance, but there's absolutely no need at this point to panic. The other reason why we could be susceptible to more panic than is warranted is that we live in the age of information, and information travels very fast. I mean, just think about how we thought about this last night and how we think about it tonight, and it's in 24 hours there's been such a change in perspective. And hearing about it constantly, it's constantly being repeated, constant information that comes to us even without our having to seek it out. And then the risk as well, since anybody can post anything, that the risk of there being misinformation is much greater, and therefore we have to, first of all, warn our children if they are online, as they have to get information from reliable sources and help give them the proper perspective and take the proper perspective ourselves about the extent of the danger and the risk that takes place. The media is going to report tragic news much quicker than the kind of reassuring information that you just heard from one of the experts in the field. So we have to take this seriously, but we shouldn't panic. Now, first thing we have to do, even before you speak to your children, is to reach a sort of consensus yourself, to reach a point where you understand it and you put it in proper perspective. If you're overly panicked, if you're overly anxious about something, you can try as hard as you can. You're not going to fool the children. Children read every nuance in our voice and they know us like books. So you have to have the right level of concern and not overly so or not too little before you can even discuss it with your children. And so the first work comes with yourself, a little bit like what they say in the airplane, that you should put the mask on yourself first before you give it over to your child. So listen to the information, process what we spoke about tonight, get into the right place, and then you process it with your children. Another very important point, especially with very young children, is that children who are scared or potentially scared are listening more to our voice tone and our body language than any particular words we use. And when we address these matters with our children, and if we want to give them the right perspective, it's extremely important that we become cognizant of how we say it. And our body language, etc., which should give over a modicum of concern, but no panic, etc. So while we may think about what words we're going to use, we have to be very aware of the manner and tone in which we give over those words as well. The other thing that's important, both with ourselves, but more so with our children, that the messages should be consistent. If for whatever reason you think that the information that's been imparted tonight is not correct and not accurate, and if you're going to say one thing to your child and the teacher's going to say something else and a third person is going to say something different, their anxiety would be through the roof. So we need as a community, again, that's the tremendous value of this kind of phone call. We need to have fairly consistent messages. We need to impart a correct and accurate perspective in terms of what kind of danger exists and what kind of precautionary measures are necessary. And if we ourselves, but more so our children, hear consistent messages from all the different sources that they look up to, such as parents, teachers, big brothers, uncles, aunts, grandparents, then they're going to adjust and adapt remarkably, and children are incredibly adaptive. Let me talk about children at different ages. The preschool-age children there's no real reason to explain to them much about the presence of coronavirus or anything like that. Children at that age are used to adults telling them to do all sorts of things that to them don't make much sense, and they're compliant. I mean, if you want, you can tell them that there is a sickness that we have to take precaution from. Again, but with these children this age, you must be very aware of the tone and manner in which you speak. And if you say it with assurance, and if you say it with a sense of certainty, they're going to listen and they're not going to experience any kind of panic. It also does not make much sense for a preschool-age child, a child under age 6, to tell them that something is rare. Their whole world is about 3 blocks long, and the word rare doesn't mean much to them. I think you can impart the sense that we are, that we're taking precautions this in order not to get sick, and this is what you have to do, and then we won't have to worry about it, but you don't have to talk to them about the frequency of this ailment, et cetera, because at this point they don't understand how expansive the world is. School-age children do. So in other words, from, let's say, ages 6 and older, they understand how big the world is and how many billions of people there are in the world, and therefore, if you want to tell them that this is a rare disease, that this is not one that's inflicting any significant portion of the population, we can tell them that. So as we explain to school-age children, they can understand the concept of it being rare, or school-age children and older. And the other thing with preschool-age children is we certainly want to teach them hygiene, and we want to teach them to wash their hands, and we want to teach them not as much as possible not to touch their face. We know children this age very often have their fingers in their mouth and up their noses, etc. And again, we would teach it to them like we would teach anything else that comes together with all the other kind of behaviors that we emphasize with children. But with preschool-age children, I would recommend that it's done maybe in a more playful kind of fashion. It could be a mnemonic. It could be a little riddle or poem that you say to them. It could even be a song. It could be something you could explain to them by reading them a storybook or by using puppets or something like that. And when children this age in particular do engage in the proper kind of hygienic behavior, if they do wash their hands with soap and water after going to the bathroom, we can praise them and we can lavish them with praise. And you might think, well, that just should be ordinary, but this is an age where children are very invested in pleasing adults, and sometimes their motivation for doing proper behavior is not because they have a sophisticated understanding of the health benefits, but because they want to please parents. So it's okay then to tell them how wonderful they are, how great they are, and how proud you are that they're doing the right thing, and make it a bit of a simcha that they engaged in regular kind of hygienic behavior. And again, it don't have to be strict, shouldn't yell, but gently if they see this sign to put their hands to the mouth, or they have these kind of habits of putting fingers in the mouth to physically remove the hand and caress them, or, give them a back rub or something, calm them down and get them used to, or giving them something else to do when they would routinely touch their face or their mouth. The older children, you can really explain it. From 6 and older, of course, you can explain to them in terms of it. They'll understand the idea of germs. You can certainly give them a rationale why you're encouraging them, A, to be more careful about washing their hands, or when they're coming in after the day of school to wash up and with soap and water to take their time doing so. And they understand the concept of germs, and they can understand as well, as I said earlier, than the concept of it being rare. Children between ages of about 6 to 12, let's say school-age children, are often very invested in the factual information, the facts of what's happening. And so they may have a lot of questions about why, where, when, and because they're interested in facts, which is very typical for this age. It's an age where they try to differentiate between fact and fantasy, but because of that reason, they're also much more susceptible to rumors. So they'll be the type of children that if somebody, all it takes is an older kid or some misinformation on the internet, etc., and it will catch on like wildfire. And we have to encourage our children that they hear something scary, or if they hear something that makes them feel that they're more at risk than is warranted, that they should come to the responsible adult. They should come to parents, teachers, and do a fact check or reality check on what they hear. Adolescents, of course, we really don't have to instruct them on cleanliness and hygiene. That by now they should know, or they've read about it. And they certainly have a full grasp of the concept of something being rare and still potentially harmful, and therefore we take precautions. So the understanding of the situation is within the rubric of what they can grasp. The issue with adolescents that would be a concern, and I would urge parents not to do this, is the possibility that this is some sort of divine punishment, or to look for a culprit, to try to understand this or explain this in the concept of some ideology or some political perspective. And I would try to discourage that, or try to interest them in just letting them know that this is very early, we can't really fully understand it, and just take the necessary precautions and not to get overly caught up in the possible reasons, causes, or who's at fault. And again, here we have to be concerned about what's on the internet and what they may read, because again, it just takes one posting or one biased report that can sort of trigger that kind of response. Very important in terms of working with children is to understand the different types of children and how your perspective will be for different type of children. For example, a child who's more prone to anxiety, a child who by nature tends to be anxious. I'm not even talking about a child that may have like a full-blown anxiety disorder, but just a kid who's more within the normal range, more anxious. Obviously, you don't have to alarm them anymore. If anything, it'll also be the type of children that you'd have to sort of calm down more and give them a more realistic perspective on what's happening. But you can have the opposite extreme as well. There are certain children who by nature have too little anxiety. Sometimes these are the kids who are kind of the daredevils, or the kind of kids who don't like to be made to feel anxious and don't take things too seriously. And that might be the child you might have to focus a little bit more on the potential harm and danger, and even scare them a little bit. Not a lot, but scare them a little bit, because they're not prone, it's not their nature to be anxious or concerned. The other type of child that might require a more special kind of intervention are what we sometimes refer to as the dysregulated children, or most famously the ADHD children, the children with attention deficit disorder, who can understand and may even be capable of being anxious or concerned, but don't have necessarily the restraint, the full restraint to pause and think, etc. They'd be the type of child who might run out of the bathroom because they're in the middle of an exciting game and forget to wash, or might more likely forget some of the health messages that we want to give them. And therefore, those are the types of kids who they may need more reminders, or you might have to sort of dress rehearsal with them. You might have to practice them, literally practice, put them in the bathroom and say they just finished what are you going to do? And walk them to the sink and make them practice it again so it becomes habitual, because the delay of between what they're doing and what they may want to do that next second is very short with these types of children. And so you may have to sort of work it into them in a kind of rehearsed and practiced way. In the event that any children will be home, if it does happen, as has happened already to 2 schools, possibly a third, as we recently heard, that they have to be home for a while. If the children are home like that, it's, again, explain to them with the proper perspective that we're just being overly cautious, that there isn't some great danger going on out there. But mostly important as well is to make sure they have activities for the day. And in fact, I would even suggest, in contrast to, say, when they're off for a vacation or a Yom Tov where we can make it very recreational, I would encourage it under the circumstances, if they're off from a day of school because of a quarantine of some sort, that the day should have an academic piece to it. I read a letter that was sent from one of the schools in our neighborhood, and they mentioned that they already have in place remote access, so there can actually be classes in case the school has to close down. And I think that's a good idea, and I would recommend other schools have that in place in case it's necessary. But even if not, there should be assignments, and as much as possible, they should feel like they're in school. The preservation of the routine is comforting to children, and idle time would be the worst. If they're just sitting around with nothing to do, or bored or something like that, or just playing one game over the other, or watching too much TV, it'll increase their anxiety, won't reduce it. So there should be a program. Now, this is kind of hard, especially if you have 2 working parents, and recognize that. And you'll have to try to do this as best we can. But I would certainly suggest that they have as much as possible a routine, and that as much as possible a continuation of the school work, so they recognize that this isn't a vacation, this is a temporary and precautionary disruption of their school day, but the academic expectations and demands continue. Again, as Roy mentioned, we can't predict the future. We don't know what's happening. He quoted Chazal. I quote Yogi Berra, who once said that prognosticating is very difficult, especially about the future. So we don't know what comes up. I can say that I'm certainly available, and members of the Ohel trauma team are available. I'll share my telephone number. My number is 516-374-3600, 516-374-3600. And my easiest email address is Dr. Blumenthal, like Dr. and Blumenthal, at gmail.com. If anybody has any particular questions regarding the children or concerns. I left out one thing I just want to mention very quickly. If there is the presence of illness in the home, or if there's a history of illness, or there are other current stresses in the home, then children may be more prone, or you yourself may be more prone to anxiety and concern, because anxiety and fear builds on each other. So that should be a concern on your mind as well. But again, any of these particular concerns or the unique aspect regarding yourself or your children, please feel free to call. And again, I thank everybody for this. I think it's testimony to our care for our family and our community as long as we bear on the line. And again, thank Rabbi Trump for arranging this.